Tom Stanton never intended to live alone, let alone on the edge of the state, tucked between an overgrown patch of pine woods and a crumbling rural road where the street signs had long since rusted into illegibility. He hadn't chosen that land because it was beautiful, or private, or affordable. He bought it because that was where she had asked to be buried. Lily hadn't said it directly. She wasn't the type to make demands. But in one of their last real conversations before the tumors took her voice, she had gestured weakly to a photo on his workbench, the one with her smiling in front of the old oaks. She had whispered, barely audible, "Keep me close to those trees, where it's quiet." It was the only request she had made, and it was the only one that mattered. When she died, Tom buried her himself on a legal family plot he fought the state for 6 months to approve. Not a cemetery. He didn't want strangers walking over her. He poured the concrete slab himself, carved her name into the granite, and planted white irises around the edges that he re-soiled and reseeded every season like clockwork. The bench beside her grave was carved from cedar and sealed twice yearly. Nothing in Tom's life had been consistent except this ritual, keeping her space perfect, sacred, intact. Tom wasn't friendly. Not anymore. That version of himself died with her. What remained was a man of routines. Morning started with hot black coffee, 2 boiled eggs, a quick check of the perimeter fence, and then 30 minutes sitting in silence by the grave, rain or shine. Sometimes he'd speak out loud to her. Other times he'd just watch the trees sway and listen to the wind. His closest neighbors, not that they were close, kept a distance. The land around his was largely abandoned or sold off in parcels, some of which had recently been bought up by people he didn't know. And in rural places like this, not knowing your neighbors was fine. In fact, Tom preferred it. He didn't care for barbecue invites or passive-aggressive HOA letters. His life had boiled down to one priority: maintaining the only piece of the world that still held meaning. So, when he pulled up that Friday afternoon and saw the unfamiliar white SUV parked half off the dirt road, he felt it immediately in his stomach. The quiet was broken. His truck crawled past it, tires crunching slowly, eyes scanning. Music played from a speaker somewhere, the lazy thump of pop beats bleeding into the woods. A child's laugh rang out, followed by a splash and a shriek. Tom's brow tightened. He rounded the bend where the tree line opened into the clearing near Lily's grave and saw them. A woman in a lemon-colored blouse reclining in a folding chair, iced drink in hand, and a boy no older than 7 or 8, pants around his ankles, urinating directly onto the marble headstone. For several seconds, Tom said nothing. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white, heart kicking harder than it had in years. He stepped out without slamming the door, boots hitting the earth with slow, deliberate weight. The boy noticed him first and froze. The woman turned casually, as if expecting a neighborly hello, and smiled. "Oh, hey there," she said brightly, waving a perfectly manicured hand. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was back here. Thought this was just some old park space or something." Tom didn't speak. He looked at the headstone, soaked, sullied, and then back to the woman. "That's private property," he said, low but steady. "You're on my land. That's my wife's grave." The woman's smile faltered slightly, but not out of guilt. It was the kind of smirk that faltered when someone realized they might be inconvenienced. "Well, it's not marked or anything," she said with a half-laugh. "No fence, no sign. And we didn't mean any disrespect, obviously. Kids are kids." Tom looked at the boy, now sheepish and backing away, and then back to her. His voice sharpened. "You let your son piss on a grave." "Sir, you're being dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes. "He didn't know, and it's not like anyone else comes here. It's just dirt with a rock." Tom's mouth was a hard line. He pointed. "Go. Now." That's when her tone shifted. She stood up, not flustered but irritated. "You don't need to be rude. I was being civil. This place is disgusting anyway. Maybe you shouldn't just leave dead bodies laying around where people hike." Tom stepped forward. The woman took a reflexive half-step back, but he didn't move beyond the line between them. He simply stared. "You're trespassing. Next time, I won't ask you to leave. You'll be removed." Her smile returned, thinner this time. She gave a shrug, took her son's hand, and began packing up her things. "You know," she said over her shoulder, "good neighbors don't act like psychopaths. You could have just put up a little sign or something." Tom didn't reply. He waited until she was gone, the SUV reversing in the gravel, music still playing, the boy not making eye contact. Then he kneeled beside the grave, took out a bottle of distilled water and a rag, and began to clean. It took 20 minutes. He didn't speak, didn't blink much, just wiped and wiped and wiped. That night, he didn't sleep. Something gnawed at him. Not just the disrespect, but her face, the smugness, the entitlement. It wasn't just rudeness, it was contempt. Contempt for death, for memory, for sacred things, and that made her dangerous. The next morning, Tom drove into town and purchased a trail camera. He didn't want to. He hated the idea of surveilling the resting place of someone who once said she hated being watched. But necessity outweighed principle. The camera was motion-triggered, disguised inside a knot of a tree near the clearing. It wouldn't catch much. He hoped it wouldn't have to. 3 days passed. The clearing remained undisturbed. He kept coming at dawn and dusk. No sign of intrusion. Then, on the 4th morning, he found the flowers overturned, trampled. One of the irises was snapped in half, and something new had been placed at the foot of the grave. A crumpled juice box, the straw still sticking out, jammed into the soil like a crude flag. Tom didn't scream. He didn't call anyone. He didn't grab a gun or storm her property. He took the juice box, put it in a Ziploc bag, and drove it to a waste processing facility out of town. Then he filed for a formal boundary reaffirmation with the county. Then he spent 3 hours drafting a cease and desist notice with clear demarcation of private burial land under state recognition. And after all that, he picked up his spade, measured 2 feet from the edge of the clearing, and began to dig. He wasn't sure, at that moment, what exactly he was building. A trench, a barrier, a warning, maybe all 3. But he knew one thing. Whatever line Karen thought she could cross, it would now be written in dirt and stone, and no child, no neighbor, no smug smile would cross it again without consequence. 3 days after he started digging the trench, Tom received an envelope in his mailbox with no return address. The handwriting on the front was forced and almost juvenile, as if the writer was pressing too hard into the paper, each letter like it had been stabbed into place. He knew before opening it who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper, photocopied, grainy, and slightly crooked as if hastily assembled. It was a complaint filed with the county stating that a resident, unnamed, was illegally modifying land adjacent to a shared access area, potentially creating water flow hazards and impeding passive pedestrian access. The phrasing was ridiculous, yet it was crafted just well enough to sound official. At the bottom was a signature, Karen Bradford. Below that, a handwritten note had been added, not part of the form, just scrawled across the bottom margin. "You should be thanking me for keeping your little patch visible. Left alone, it'll rot like she did. Tom read the letter twice, then again. He didn't feel rage. Not yet. What he felt was deeper, like someone had reached into his chest and twisted something slow and thick. He stood there for a full 5 minutes on his porch, envelope in hand, then folded the letter carefully and placed it in a folder labeled Interactions KB. He had started keeping one the week before. It already had 6 items. He didn't speak of it to anyone, didn't call a lawyer, didn't post about it, didn't mention it at the feed store or during his rare trips into town. Tom believed in doing things the right way, but he didn't believe in asking for help every time a snake slithered too close to his boots. Some things needed to be handled directly, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Later that afternoon, he went back out to the trench. It had taken on a more defined shape, 2 feet wide, 1.5 feet deep, following the length of the property border that separated his clearing from Karen's. The soil was hard-packed and root-tangled, but Tom didn't mind the labor. He welcomed it. His palms had blistered. He didn't tape them. The ache in his back wasn't a burden. It was a tether. Pain kept him close to the purpose. But as he reached the edge of the trench that bordered most closely to her land, he noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. A small pile of dog feces, deliberately left right at the lip of the trench. The pile was still steaming slightly, fresh, unmistakably intentional. Next to it was a single garden gnome, painted bright red, with its middle finger raised. Tom didn't react. He didn't even pick it up. He simply stood, staring at it, then turned away and walked inside. That night, he adjusted the settings on his trail camera, widening the motion capture angle. He installed a second camera farther up in a tree, aimed diagonally down at the grave from above, and angled to capture the borderline. He made sure the batteries were fresh. The feed didn't stream to a cloud or app. Tom didn't trust that kind of thing. Instead, it saved to a physical SD card he swapped out every morning at sunrise. He wasn't trying to collect proof for a lawsuit. He was collecting understanding. He needed to know exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. The kind of person who smiles as her child desecrates a grave, who leaves threats wrapped in legalese, who paints obscenities on lawn ornaments and treats grief like an inconvenience. Karen wasn't a nuisance. She was a kind of rot, the kind that sets in slow, spreads under the surface, unnoticed until everything it touches starts to stink. 2 mornings later, Tom woke to find a note pinned to his front gate. It was folded over, sealed with tape, and decorated with glitter. It looked like a child's birthday card. Inside was a photograph, a printed snapshot. Grainy, but recognizable, a picture of Lily's grave, taken from above, with red liquid. He prayed it was paint, smeared across the stone in an X. Next to it, someone had scrawled the words, "Move on," in black marker. No signature, no context. Just a message that hit like a cold slap. Tom didn't shout. He didn't call the sheriff. He took the photo inside, placed it in the folder, then walked out to the trench which he hadn't touched in 2 days. He extended it. He didn't just continue digging along the side. He cut in deeper toward her yard, still within his legal property line, but just enough to be seen clearly from her back window. With each foot of dirt removed, he felt something release in him. Not peace, not satisfaction, but clarity. This wasn't an overreaction. This was containment. He was building a wound to hold the infection, and it needed to be deep enough that nothing could crawl through. That evening, Karen returned the volley. Not with words or calls, but with noise. She rolled a large speaker onto her porch, one of those oversized outdoor DJ setups, and began blasting audio at near maximum volume. Not music, not yelling, just a looped recording of children laughing, shrieking, giggling, over and over, high-pitched and distorted. It started at sunset and didn't stop until nearly 2 in the morning. Tom didn't step outside. He didn't try to unplug it. He sat inside his home, silent, still, staring at the wall, the sound pouring through the cracks of his cabin like water under a door. When it finally stopped, the silence felt louder than the laughter had. The next morning, Tom received a knock at the door. It wasn't police. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a county inspector. Young, polite, visibly uncomfortable. He explained that a report had been filed regarding unpermitted earthwork on Tom's land. The inspector tried to soften it, saying it was probably nothing, but he needed to take some photos and measure the trench. Tom said nothing for nearly a full minute. Then he walked out, handed the man a folder with copies of his survey, land rights certification, and excavation permits. The inspector blinked at the completeness of the documentation. When asked what had triggered the report, the inspector didn't give a name, but the look in his eyes told Tom everything. Before the man left, he paused awkwardly on the porch and said, "Look, I don't know what this is about, but off the record, I've seen stuff like this before. They escalate until someone snaps. Just be careful." Tom didn't respond. Not with words. He simply turned, walked back to the trench, and began measuring again. He wasn't done yet. The border wasn't just about property anymore. It was about memory. It was about warning. It was about making damn sure the next time someone brought a child into that space and told them the past didn't matter, they'd have to cross a line so deep, so real, so undeniable, that even they would pause before stepping over it. And if they didn't, well, the ground would be ready. The trench was no longer just a physical barrier. It had become a psychological declaration, a message carved into the earth itself that said, "Here, you stop." It followed a precise line, hugging the edge of Tom's property, curving slightly where the ground dipped near the old sycamore, and then tightening into a near-perfect arc as it approached the slope closest to Karen's yard. By the time he finished reinforcing the sides with rough stones, it looked less like a landscaping feature and more like the perimeter of a siege. It wasn't beautiful, and it wasn't meant to be. It was deliberate, functional, unmistakably territorial. And yet he knew the statement would not be respected. Karen wasn't the kind of person who responded to boundaries with reflection or remorse. She saw lines not as limits but as challenges, markers of where to press next. Tom's suspicion proved correct 3 days later when he came home to find his side of the trench completely filled in. Not with soil, not with sand, with garbage. Household waste, broken glass, crumpled fast food bags, ripped plastic toys, and what looked like half a gutted mattress. There was a dead squirrel in the pile, half buried, its fur matted with something sticky and dark. Flies buzzed thick in the humid air. The stench was immediate, offensive, purposeful. She hadn't just dumped trash, she'd desecrated, and she wanted him to know it. He didn't call sanitation. He didn't even touch it at first. Instead, he went inside, wrote down the date and time, and added it to the log he had begun keeping in his desk drawer. Then he reviewed the footage from the overhead camera. It was grainy. Early morning fog had blurred the edges, but the figure was unmistakable. Karen, dressed in a pale blue tracksuit, dragging 2 large plastic bins to the edge of the trench, flipping them over slowly and methodically, like she was planting something rather than disposing of it. She didn't move in a hurry. She didn't even look around. It was clear she didn't fear consequences because people like her never do. To them, Everything was an inconvenience or a game. Other people's pain was a performance stage for their own grievances. Tom spent the entire afternoon clearing the trench. He wore thick gloves and wrapped a scarf around his nose to block the smell. He separated the trash into burnable and non-burnable piles, not because it mattered to her, but because it mattered to him. When the trench was empty again, he deepened it another half-foot. That night, he burned the refuse. Flames licked the sky higher than he'd expected, casting a glow that danced across the edges of her property. He stood beside the fire, arms crossed, watching the blackened mattress coil into smoke. Across the yard, a window lit up. He didn't need to see her face to know she was watching. The next morning, he found a note nailed to a tree near the grave. Not taped, not pinned, nailed. The paper was thick, coated in plastic, waterproof. It read, "Unauthorized incineration of materials may constitute a public hazard." No signature. But the font was the same one she used on her social media rants. He had seen enough screenshots sent by mutual neighbors. The paper was torn at the corners, not clean cut. She'd printed it in haste. That detail stayed with him. It meant she was reacting. And if she was reacting, it meant she was afraid. Not of him physically, but of the silence, of the refusal to play her game. Tom never yelled back, never confronted her with the kind of attention she sought. He simply acted. And people like Karen feared nothing more than being rendered irrelevant. Still, escalation was inevitable. He knew it, and it came not with another letter or pile of trash, but with a noise. A deep, grinding metal sound that began around 2 a.m. and didn't stop for nearly 15 minutes. Tom had been sleeping lightly and woke at the first note of it, already dressed within seconds. The sound came from the slope near the far end of the trench. He didn't use a flashlight. His eyes had adjusted. The moon was high. The noise stopped as he stepped outside. By the time he reached the trench, the intruder was gone. But the damage wasn't subtle. Someone had tried to drive something, a piece of machinery or a small quad, across the trench. The impact had crushed one of the retaining stone walls and collapsed nearly 3 feet of the edge. Deep tire tracks ran up her side of the slope and vanished into the grass. Tom stood there for a long time, not out of confusion, but because something felt off. The collapse hadn't been random. The trench was compromised at the exact point where the soil had been softest. That meant someone had studied it. Karen, he realized, wasn't acting alone anymore. Someone else was involved. Someone who understood terrain, who had patience. That changed things. The following morning, he filed a formal trespassing affidavit through the county office and submitted a parcel boundary enforcement request. It was the first paper trail he'd created outside of his folder. It would take weeks to process, and he knew that, but it was enough to force a legal eye onto the situation. While waiting at the office, he overheard a conversation that turned his stomach. Another man, filing paperwork for fence repairs, casually mentioned that the lady 2 plots over had warned him about the weirdo who lives by the woods, said he kept dead things near his wife's grave and burned trash in the open to keep spirits away. The clerk didn't laugh. She just nodded and said, "That's Karen. She's got complaints against half the road." Tom didn't interrupt. He left without speaking and returned home in silence. But the gravity of that moment stayed with him. Karen was not just attacking him directly, she was building a myth, seeding a story, shaping a persona around him to isolate, discredit, and eventually provoke. The goal wasn't just conflict, it was erasure. 2 nights later, the power went out. Not the neighborhood, not the grid, just his house. He checked the breaker, everything in place. The generator didn't kick in. When he checked the unit behind the shed, he found the fuel line had been sliced with something thin and sharp, almost surgically. The cut was clean, the rubber still taut, no fraying. Next to it, half buried in the soil, was a cigarette butt, lipstick smudged. He added it to the folder. Tom spent the rest of the night sitting on his porch with a lantern and a loaded bolt-action rifle by his side. Not to use it. Not yet. Just to hold space. Let them see the silhouette. Let them feel watched. The next morning, a package arrived. No return address again. Inside was a copy of the obituary he'd written for Lily, printed out from the newspaper archive and annotated with red marker. Circles around words like beloved, peaceful, resilient, and the phrase survived by her husband. Below that, someone had written, "She left because she wanted to. You're the only one pretending." Tom didn't shake. He didn't cry. He sat at his kitchen table for almost an hour, just breathing. Then he stood, walked outside, and began deepening the trench again, this time with rebar stakes driven vertically into the soil every 3 feet. The line wouldn't be symbolic anymore. It would be reinforced, and anyone trying to cross it would feel it in their ankles. Tom didn't sleep much anymore, not because of fear, but because rest required a kind of detachment he could no longer afford. There was no luxury in pretending night was just night, or that silence meant safety. Every hour he spent unconscious felt like an invitation. So he adapted. His days bled into his nights, and his rituals changed. Coffee became constant. Movement replaced reflection. Instead of visiting Lily's grave each morning in solitude, he began inspecting the perimeter twice, 3 times a day, rechecking every camera angle, walking the trench edge to toe the line with his own boots as if affirming to the earth that he was still there, still watching, still willing to dig deeper. His trench, now reinforced with metal stakes and a second row of stones, looked more like a defensive position than anything resembling a memorial border. He didn't care. Function over symbolism. And that function was now clearer than ever. It had been a week since the generator sabotage and the cigarette with the lipstick stain. He hadn't seen Karen since, not in person, not even at a distance. Her windows remained curtained, her driveway empty. But the absence wasn't relief. It was strategy. The kind of withdrawal a predator makes before pouncing. And Tom wasn't going to sit idle waiting for the next provocation. He didn't believe in proactive aggression, but he believed in anticipation. And so he began mapping everything. Entry points, camera blind spots, soil density, even light patterns around the property at different times of day. He started keeping a second logbook, separate from the incident folder, a tactical one. He didn't know if it would ever matter to anyone but him, but if things escalated to a point of no return, someone, someday, should understand how much he had tried to protect his line without crossing it. Then came the package. It was delivered by hand, not mail, no postal stamp, no label, no tracking slip. Just a cardboard box left on his porch sometime in the early morning. Inside was a photo album, dusty with a faded floral pattern on the cover. He recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Lily. It wasn't something he'd left outside or lost. It had been kept inside, in the chest by their bed, sealed with a clasp only he opened. Someone had been in his home. The realization didn't come with shock or panic, but with an icy clarity that took his breath for several seconds. He flipped through the pages slowly, not even realizing his hands were shaking until the photos began to blur. Page after page, Moments from their life together had been vandalized, faces scratched out with pen, captions smeared, one page entirely torn. On the final page, in place of a photo, was a small laminated piece of paper. It was a printed permit, forged, using county letterhead but with incorrect formatting. Subtle mistakes only someone familiar with the process would catch. The permit claimed Karen had temporary jurisdiction over the adjacent land for historical restoration. It was fake, but it was close enough to confuse someone who didn't know better. Tom didn't call the police. He didn't contact the county. Instead, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in 5 years, a woman named Valerie, who worked in records verification for the county's infrastructure division. He kept the conversation brief, professional, asked her to verify whether any permits had been issued or requested for Karen Bradford concerning land use or preservation. Valerie sounded hesitant, but checked. There were no requests, no permits, no applications pending, but her voice dropped slightly when she added, "She's tried before, twice, blocked both times, always something involving graves." Tom thanked her and hung up. He didn't tell her about the album. He didn't need to. The only thing he needed now was confirmation. And now he had it. That night, he walked the trench again. But something had shifted. The ground felt off beneath his boots. Not softer, not disturbed, just unfamiliar, like walking through a room that had been rearranged in the dark. He paused at the bend where the trench curved closest to her land and noticed something strange. The rebar stakes had been removed. Not all of them, just 4, spaced evenly. Each hole was filled back in, camouflaged. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. And, more importantly, they knew how to avoid the cameras. Tom didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood in the dark, listening to the wind, wondering if she was watching right now, hidden behind the glass, smiling. He returned inside and retrieved one of the older trail cameras, one he'd taken down after upgrading, and mounted it under the eaves, pointed not at the trench, but at his own front door. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He emptied his safe. Not just the rifle and the documents. He took everything out, laid it all on the table, and began deciding what would remain accessible and what would be buried. There were maps, old deeds, letters, things that didn't belong in the fire, but also didn't belong in someone else's hands. If she could break into his home once, she could do it again. This wasn't paranoia. This was evidence-based survival. He wasn't waiting to be erased. The next morning, the second camera caught movement. Not at the door, at the side fence. A figure, unmistakably Karen, leaning over the fence line with a small bag in her hands, shaking it slowly across the top of his soil. The footage was brief, blurry, but it was clear she was dispersing something. Seeds, maybe, or powder. He examined the area an hour later. The earth smelled bitter. The grass along that strip began to wither within 12 hours. By the following morning, a 3-foot stretch of turf had browned entirely. Whatever she had poured wasn't symbolic. It was chemical. That same day, Tom received a call from the county. Not about her, not about the cameras, not about the forged permit. A report had been filed claiming Tom was conducting unauthorized waste burning in a conservation zone. The fine was steep, and the notice included a requirement for a site inspection within the next week. Tom didn't argue. He scheduled the inspection. But that night, as he sat beside the grave, the realization settled in like cold water through his spine. She wasn't escalating to provoke him anymore. She was building a case, laying groundwork, shaping the narrative. By the time the trench was filled, the grave defiled, and his name whispered through every county office as the old man with the dead wife and the sick lawn. No one would believe anything he said. The cameras would be called manipulated, the photos staged, the warnings dismissed, unless he did something now. Not violent, not desperate, but definitive. He walked to the shed and began gathering tools, not for attack, but for transformation. If she wanted to make him look insane, he would give her something she couldn't explain. Not madness, not aggression, control. Measured, methodical, undeniable control. And when it was done, when the next visitor arrived to inspect his land, there would be no confusion. Only one message engraved across every inch of the trench and grave and border. This place is not yours, and it never will be. Tom didn't know the moment things crossed the threshold from harassment into active war, but by the time the inspector arrived, he understood it had already happened. The man was polite, professional, and visibly uncomfortable from the first handshake. He carried a clipboard, wore county insignia, and did everything by the book, but his eyes never quite met Tom's. He inspected the trench first, took photos, made notes, measured the depth, checked the soil for contamination, and verified rebar placement. Then he asked, somewhat awkwardly, if Tom had any items of controlled waste that had been burned on site. Tom showed him the barrel, already cleaned and empty, and presented a printed log of burned contents from the past month. Only yard waste, wood, and personal papers. The man nodded, muttered that it all looked fine, and then, just as he was about to leave, hesitated. He asked casually if Tom was aware that a local resident had concerns about environmental degradation, and Tom nodded without smiling. The inspector cleared his throat and said, "Off the record, she's filed over 40 complaints county-wide in the past 2 years. She names a new person every month. You're just the next one." Tom thanked him. The man didn't respond. He left quickly without further comment. That evening, Tom stood at the edge of the trench, staring into it as if expecting it to speak back. The space looked different now. Not just deeper or more defined, but loaded, heavy with memory and intent. The soil itself felt altered, as if absorbing everything that had happened, holding it like a wound holds shrapnel. Karen had not responded to the inspection by showing her face. She'd remained hidden, distant, but her shadow had grown. He found new tire tracks near the rear tree line, smaller, narrower than her SUV, likely a dirt bike or compact quad. He found cigarette butts near his eastern fence and a single blue bracelet, child-sized, looped around a fence nail. He found a dead crow nailed to his back porch with a thumbtack, its wings spread unnaturally wide, and a sticky note on its chest that read, "Birds carry souls. This one won't fly anymore." He removed it carefully, placed the body in a burial box, and wrote the date and time in the log without a tremor in his hand. Later that night, he drove 40 miles to a metal shop he hadn't visited in years and commissioned a custom grate system. Steel slats, 5-foot lengths, spaced tightly, durable enough to withstand weather and pressure. When asked what it was for, he simply said, "Erosion control." Then he stopped at a lumber yard and ordered 12 sheets of marine plywood, sealant, and a load of decorative river stone. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about establishing formality. If Karen wanted to treat the line between their worlds like a suggestion, he would turn it into a barrier so official, so permanent, it would make even the most passive inspector hesitate before asking a question. By the following week, the trench had been reinforced with both vertical and horizontal support, the inner walls framed, lined and overlaid with anchored stone. It looked less like a trench now and more like a deliberate defensive installation, something between a canal and a fortress ditch. Tom installed motion-activated lights along the perimeter, not bright enough to wake anyone, but sharp enough to silhouette a figure from 100 feet. It worked. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 3rd, someone triggered the lights at 2:42 a.m. The camera caught the figure halfway through a crawl under the side fence. A teenager, probably, wearing a hoodie and sneakers, face obscured. The figure froze, realizing the lights were active, then bolted back the way it came. Tom didn't pursue. He didn't even stand. He simply sat on the porch in the dark, waiting. 30 minutes later, Karen's back door opened. Her silhouette stood in the doorway for several seconds, unmoving, and then disappeared inside. The following day, things changed again. It began subtly. His mail started arriving late, misdelivered, sometimes not at all. Then small boxes appeared on his doorstep. Opened Amazon packages addressed to names he didn't recognize. At first he thought they were delivery errors, but then noticed the contents. Books about grief therapy, living with delusion, and managing antisocial behavior. On the 3rd day, someone left a copy of the DSM-V with a page dog-eared to the section on persistent complex bereavement disorder. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She wasn't trying to threaten him now. She was trying to discredit him, undermine him from the inside out, make his grief look like pathology. But Tom didn't respond. Not in kind. He didn't escalate. Instead, he started preparing something that would outlive the game. He began building a memorial wall, not just for Lily, but for the truth. A low, curved stone wall that arched behind her grave, built from salvaged materials, sealed and inscribed by hand. Every brick bore a word, not poetic or sentimental phrases, but cold facts, dates, times, filings, actions, a timeline etched into stone. Anyone who approached the grave would see it. Anyone who tried to tell a different story would be confronted by irrefutable history. Karen responded by placing a speaker in her window and blasting ambient sounds. Sometimes birds, sometimes wind, sometimes children whispering. She changed the audio every night. The whispers were the worst, barely audible, maddeningly vague. Phrases like, "He did it," "She's not gone," and "They know," repeated in loops that never synced. Tom recorded them, filtered them, transcribed them. Then he played them back on a loop of his own, slowed, reversed, overlapped with silence. It wasn't for her. It was for him. Understanding the pattern helped dilute its power. The real break came when a letter arrived, this time official, this time notarized. It was a cease and desist from Karen's attorney, accusing Tom of sustained psychological intimidation, environmental hostility, and symbolic aggression via structural installations. It demanded removal of the trench, the wall, the lights, and the cameras within 30 days. It threatened litigation. It included photos, poorly angled out of context but enough to confuse an uninformed third party. Tom read it carefully, then scanned and filed every page. The next morning, he submitted his own response, 5 pages, indexed with diagrams, references, and notarized statements from county records. He didn't attach the photos of the crow. He didn't mention the whispers or the vandalized album. Those weren't for paper. Those were for the land, for the wall. 2 days later, the retaliation came. At 4:17 a.m., someone set fire to the tree line. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't weather. It was accelerant. He smelled it immediately, something synthetic, oily, meant to burn fast. He was outside before the flames hit the second tree. The fire was contained quickly thanks to damp soil and a recent rain, but the intent was clear. It hadn't been meant to destroy. It had been meant to terrify, scare him into retreat. But Tom didn't retreat. He planted new trees the next morning. Not saplings. Full-grown, root-balled trees, delivered by truck, lowered into place by crane, anchored with care. And behind them, he built a secondary fence, low, unpainted, lined with rebar, topped with raw wire. Karen didn't react. She didn't need to. By then, the air between them had gone still, tight, electric with what hadn't yet happened. Tom didn't know what would come next, but he knew what wouldn't happen. He wouldn't yield. He wouldn't move. And he wouldn't let her rewrite the story. Not the story of Lily. Not the story of this land. Not the story of the man who chose to dig a trench not to keep someone out, but to keep something sacred in. It had rained for 3 days straight, and by the time the clouds lifted, the trench had filled with muddy water that reflected the gray sky like a mirror cracked in the middle. Tom stood at its edge that morning, hands in his coat pockets, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth as he stared at the thin sheen of fog drifting over the surface. The water hadn't flooded because of poor planning. It had flooded because someone had blocked the drainage line. He found the plug buried a foot below the surface at the lowest point of the trench, a bundle of rags wrapped in chicken wire and bound with electrical tape, wedged into the outflow pipe with surgical precision. It had to have taken time. It had to have taken intent. And more than anything, it had to have been done by someone who understood how the trench worked, not just what it was for, but how it moved. That meant observation. That meant patience. That meant Karen, or someone she had sent, had spent hours studying the details of something they claimed to dismiss as just a ditch. He didn't call anyone. He didn't even dig the plug out right away. He stood over it for nearly 20 minutes, listening to the wind through the trees, his breath rising and curling in front of him like smoke. Something had shifted. Not just the frequency of attacks, not just their nature, but the energy behind them. This wasn't escalation anymore. This was culmination. They had crossed the point of subtlety. They had stopped hiding. Now they were trying to provoke a final, irreversible reaction. And they were close to getting one. That night, Tom heard footsteps outside his window. Not cautious ones, brazen, steady, not running or sneaking, just moving, as if the person didn't care whether they were heard or seen. He stepped out the back door with a flashlight and scanned the yard. No one. But the fence gate was ajar. Not wide open, not broken, just left slightly unlatched. The lock dangling freely as if to say, "We were here, and we could come back." He secured it, checked the cameras, and found the footage blank for that exact 10-minute window. Tampered. Deleted. That was new. The next morning, he went to the shed and pulled out a roll of concertina wire he had kept in reserve since the first incident. He didn't mount it. He didn't want the property to look like a prison. But he measured where it would go, how long it would take to install, and how far it could extend before crossing into prohibited zoning. Just knowing gave him control, and control was the last currency he had left. Later that afternoon, as he replaced the SD cards in the 2 main trail cameras, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. Laughter. Not distorted over a speaker, not recorded. Real, high-pitched, unfiltered. A child. His heart clenched. He turned toward the graveyard path and saw them, Karen and her son, standing just beyond the trench on her side of the line, the boy with his pants zipped this time, holding a toy truck, and Karen smiling with a softness that made Tom's skin crawl. She waved as if nothing had happened, as if none of the months of silent warfare had existed. "Just showing him where we don't go anymore," she called out. "Isn't that right, honey?" The boy didn't respond. He looked pale, almost dazed, his eyes locked on Tom like he was afraid to blink. Karen knelt beside him, whispered something, and the boy nodded. Then they turned and left. Tom didn't follow. He didn't shout. He stood there until their footsteps faded, and then walked to the grave and checked every inch. The stone was clean, the flowers undisturbed, but there, nestled behind the bench, almost hidden, was a small object, a strip of cloth. Not trash, not accidental. A square of Lily's old quilt, the one that had gone missing weeks after her death. He recognized the stitching, his own, from when he had repaired it during her last hospital stay. He held it for a long moment, unable to move. That night, he went through every file, every document, every photo, and assembled a master folder, physical and digital. Not for himself, for anyone who might come after. He titled it Statement of Events. He printed duplicates. He stored one at a trusted neighbor's barn 3 miles away. Then he sat by Lily's grave until dawn, listening to the wind, watching the trench glisten in the moonlight, waiting for the next break. It came at 6:04 a.m. The alert tone on his phone sounded. A motion trigger. He checked the feed and saw them. 2 figures, both male, walking along the fence line in dark clothing, one carrying what looked like a crowbar, the other with a shovel. They moved quickly, efficiently, stopping near the point where the trench met the grave path. The camera only caught them in fragments, but it was enough. They were planning to dig, to breach, to destroy. Tom didn't call 911. He called a man named Bird, a former surveyor turned consultant, who had offered help months earlier when Tom had his land resurveyed. Bird had seen enough of Karen's patterns to believe him. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes. Tom grabbed his boots, his flashlight, and the compact rifle he hadn't fired in over a year. He didn't go out to confront. He went out to record, to make sure everything that happened now would be witnessed, not just in memory, but in image, in trace, in artifact. When he reached the trench, the men were gone, but the breach had begun. A small hole at the base, fresh shovel marks, the rebar bent. He followed the tracks until they disappeared at Karen's side yard. No footprints into the house, no car, nothing. But the boy was standing at the window, staring down at him, unmoving. Tom raised a hand. Not a wave, just a flat gesture. A signal that said, "I saw." Bird arrived with a drone and a GoPro. They documented everything, filed it, archived it. That evening, Tom received a letter slipped into his mailbox with no stamp. "You should have left when she did. You're the one haunting this place, not me." No signature, no handwriting this time. Just typed, clinical, mechanical. He burned it, not in anger, in closure. Then he dug again, not to expand the trench but to add to the wall. One final inscription, chiseled slowly by hand, pressed into the center brick directly behind the grave. It read, "I am still here, Lily. They won't bury you again." By midnight, the wind picked up. Rain threatened. But Tom didn't leave the yard. He sat beside the trench with a lantern, his coat soaked through, the rifle across his lap. And when the lights flickered and the whispering started again from her speaker across the lawn, he whispered back, not in fear, but in a voice steady and certain, "I am not your victim. I am your witness. And now, finally, your reckoning has begun." The following morning broke with a stillness that didn't feel natural. The rain had stopped, but the air carried a strange, heavy scent of iron and scorched bark. The trench was dry, not from evaporation, but because someone had siphoned the water out overnight. Tom noticed the change immediately. The soil wasn't damp enough for the conditions. There were tracks again, faint, as if someone had tiptoed through the edge with purpose. But this time, they led not toward the grave, but away from it, past the tree line and into the back end of Karen's property. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. Whatever was supposed to happen next would not require a confrontation. It would unfold on its own, like all rot eventually does when the light hits it long enough. Tom returned to the house, changed into a clean shirt, brewed a pot of coffee, and waited. He had sent the entire archive, photos, logs, recordings, physical samples, documented letters, to both the county office and a private legal mediator 2 days before. And last night, Bird had forwarded the drone footage and breach analysis to a land use attorney who specialized in property harassment and environmental manipulation. Nothing could be undone, but everything now existed outside the fragile membrane of Karen's narrative. There would be no version of the truth she could control. By noon, 3 county vehicles pulled up at her house. Not loud, not aggressive, just methodical. An inspection team, 2 code enforcement officers, and a man in a gray coat who never introduced himself. They spent 2 hours on her side of the fence, measuring, mapping, comparing survey data. They asked her questions. She yelled. She laughed. She pretended not to know who Tom was. Then, when they approached the patch near the back shed, the tone shifted. Voices dropped. One officer stepped back sharply, covering his mouth. The inspector took photographs. The gray-coated man made a call. Within the hour, Karen was placed into the back of a sedan. Not cuffed, but not free. Her son stood on the porch, flanked by a woman from Child Protective Services holding a clipboard. He didn't cry. He didn't look scared. He simply stared across the yard at Tom, who nodded once. The boy nodded back. That was all. Later that evening, an investigator arrived at Tom's home, not to interrogate, but to clarify. He explained that during the property breach review, they had discovered not only tampered survey markers and forged documentation, but something buried beneath Karen's shed. A metal box containing dozens of items, photos, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, some of which included doctored images of Tom's property and Lily's grave, covered in childish, scrawled accusations. There were also articles about other families from different towns, each linked to reported harassment or suspicious property fires. Patterns, threads, a history. She had done this before. Maybe not exactly this, but enough to form a chain. And this time, she'd been caught too deeply, too publicly, too irrevocably to spin the wheel again. The investigator didn't promise anything, but he used the word involuntary more than once. The next week passed quietly. No laughter, no footsteps, no threats. Tom didn't sleep much, but not because of fear. His body simply didn't know how to shut off the guard it had lived in for so long. But in the absence of conflict, his movements became slower, more deliberate. He tended the grave without flinching. He repainted the bench. He replaced the irises. And then, on the 10th day, he walked the length of the trench one final time, placed 3 stones at its center, and filled it in. Not erased, not covered, but transitioned. Where the trench had been, he laid a flat bed of river stone, framed in blackened wood, and installed a low iron gate at the midpoint, never locked, but clearly closed. Not a wall, not a barricade, just a message. This space has rules. He never saw Karen again. He never asked where she was taken or if she'd be coming back. He didn't need closure from her because what had happened had never been about her. She was the flame, yes, but the match had been struck the moment someone decided that grief was negotiable, that memory was public, that rest could be walked over, laughed at, urinated on. What Tom built wasn't a trench. It was a reckoning. A scar the land would hold forever, not with pride, but with warning. One morning, as the sun rose behind the trees Lily had loved, he placed a final stone at the foot of her grave. Smooth, flat, unmarked, just a single gesture. Then he whispered, "They won't touch you again," and walked back inside. Alone, but never unguarded.